Looking at our world from a theological perspective. This is the Theology Central Podcast, making theology central.
Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, May the 21st, 2024. It is currently 10:36 a.m. Central Time, and I am coming to you live from the Theology Central studio, located right here in Abilene, Texas. So let me ask you a question. You know, I love to start a lot of my broadcasts that way. Sometimes I feel it's a little redundant, but I'm going to start and ask you a question. What do you believe is the biggest threat facing the church as we move through the rest of 2024 and enter into 2025? What would you identify right now as the biggest threat facing the church? Now, this is a topic that is discussed every year within Christian podcasts, Christian publications, books, you name it. It's a constant thing. This has been going on forever in the history of Christianity. Oh, what is the threat facing Christianity? What is the threat facing the church? How do we prepare for it? How do we combat it? How do we respond to it? What is it going to be? And every year, every few years, maybe the threat, people perceive the threat to change. Maybe people perceive the threat as something different. And you always have to be you got to be careful with this, right? Like you can read an article saying this is the greatest threat facing the church, and you can be like, okay, oh man, we're in trouble. This is going to be so bad. We have to do something. And then in many cases, the threat kind of comes and the threat goes, and nobody even remembers because they've moved on to the next thing. But I've been hearing it almost my entire Christian life. Oh, we have the threat. Biblical illiteracy is destroying the church. Theological illiteracy, and I have been right there in many cases each year talking about this is a threat to the church. This is a threat to Christianity. And maybe now I'm just much more jaded. Now I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever. It's a threat. Yeah, it's going to be the end. We're all going to be destroyed. And I know maybe because we live in a day and age where everything is a threat. Everything is the end. Everyone is outraged about this, and this is going to destroy us, and the economy is going to collapse, and we're going to be in World War 15 by now because of all the predictions of world wars, and we're going to all be, this is going to be destroyed, and America is falling apart, and this is going to, and there's going to be a civil war, and we're all going to die from this, and it's like sometimes it's just never ending alarm and panic. So after a point, you're just kind of like, whatever. So maybe after all of the years of keeping up with Christian news and Christian websites and listening to Christian podcasts and keeping up with what's going on in the Christian world, maybe now I'm a little bit more like, whatever. Yeah, this is the threat now. Okay, I get it. Maybe, on one hand, yeah, look, and this is just, we cannot deny this reality. When you, in a sense, start warning people and start throwing out that this is a threat and this is a danger, in some case, there's no way to get around this. In many cases, it's benefiting the one sounding the alarm and declaring the threat, right? Because because that's sensational. That's like, oh, there's this threat. So you're going to get more downloads. You're going to get more streams, or you're going to be able to write a book about it, or you're going to be able to speak at conferences warning Christians of the coming threat. And then people will be there. I remember in the 1980s, every church here in West Texas had these conferences on the threat of rock and roll and the threat of MTV and the threat of backmasking and they're coming for our kids and it's going to destroy the church. And so we have to fight against it. And so, parents were like, burning records and all the stuff that went on during that time. And then we had in the 1980s, we had the great satanic scare, right? Everyone was a Satanist and there were teams of Satanists going around that were going to kidnap us on Halloween. And it was, Satan was everywhere. And it's like every time you can just go that this is a threat and this is a danger and this is a threat. So in some ways, I'm kind of grown jaded to it. But at the same time, you can't just be like, well, everything is wonderful and everything is great because, well, that's not a reality. How do you find that balance? So when I ask you, what do you perceive to be the greatest threat to the church? You may be immediately like, you may have already gotten your paper and you're like, okay, I've got about 15 and these have to be dealt with because I'm worried about it. Or you may kind of be like, oh boy, what's not a threat anymore? I don't know where you kind of, you feel, where you find yourself. I think I've become more jaded and just like, whatever. But at the same time, I do know we have to pay attention to possible things that the church has to deal with. I mean, we have to at least be willing to discuss it and talk about it. So we're going to look at an article that was published. Let me look at the publishing date for this article. It was published on Tuesday, May the 21st, 2024. Hot off the presses. I need to do this. Hot off the press. Hot off the press. Now, I'm actually not reading it on paper. It's actually on my iPad. But okay, for sound effects. It's hot off the press. We've got a threat. In fact, this article, it reads like this. George Barna identifies the biggest threats facing the church. We've reached a time of Christian invisibility. Ooh, that sounds dangerous. That sounds bad. Now, on one hand, I know I sound like I'm mocking it. I'm not trying to mock it because I think there are threats facing the church, but we have to try to find when does it become hype? When does it become an opportunity for someone to sell a book, hold a conference? When does it become to get more downloads and more streams for their podcast? Like, when does it become that versus when it is something else? And again, who gets to determine what the threat is? But I will go back to my original question. Do you believe that the church is facing some serious threats? And what would you identify those threats to be? Now, sometimes, I think a lot of times the average person just sitting in the pew, I don't know how concerned they are about the threats facing the church. I think many people sitting in the pew, they don't really care about all of that, the latest theological controversy or this issue or this issue. I think in many cases, they're just trying to live out their Christian life. But I know the right speaker, the right preacher with the right platform can build an entire following because he's the one warning them the danger is coming, the threat is coming, and everyone's going to fall for it. So buy my book, listen to me, come to my church, and they kind of build a following on that. So it's kind of like, on one end, I think the average Christian may not be that worried about it, but if you can make them worried about it, well, then you can build a pretty substantial following, right? Much of the media is all about building a following as you constantly create panic and concern and fear and worry and anxiety that everything's falling apart, but you've got to keep listening to us because we'll tell you the truth. That seems to be a major issue in all segments of human life in 2024. But we will talk about, but here's what I thought I would do. I could go directly to this article and say, here, George Barna identifies these as the biggest threats. Here are the biggest threats. Offer my opinion and commentary on each threat and say, what do you think? And then tell you to email me right now. And I will, that will be a part of what we're going to do. But I thought it would be fun to just show you that, hey, this idea that there's a threat facing the church, it's not a new concept. And so I thought we would do a little bit of church history, right? Does that sound good? So before we look at the threats facing the church in 2024 going into 2025, let's go back and remind ourselves of a great controversy that happened in the 1800s. Because even in the 1800s, the church is in trouble. The threats are present. The threat at the time was called the downgrade controversy. The downgrade controversy. I'm assuming you've heard about it in church. I bet you've heard, your pastor has mentioned it. I know you've probably have read books about it. I mean, the downgrade controversy is one of those things like everyone knows about. So I'm not, I apologize for maybe giving you, well, obviously it's old news, but pulling an example that everyone already knows about. But still, I think it's interesting just to go, hey, we've got an article in 2024 going, here's the greatest threats facing the church. But let's go back and see what the greatest threat was in 1880. All right. The downgrade controversy was a theological dispute that occurred within the Baptist Union of Great Britain in the late 19th century, specifically involving the renowned preacher Charles Spurgeon. That's why everyone knows about this controversy, because Charles Haddon Spurgeon was right there in the middle of it. And of course, everyone knows who Charles Haddon Spurgeon is and probably have read a couple of his sermons at a minimum. All right. But here's a little bit about this controversy. Let's start with the background. The controversy began in the 1880s. When Charles Spurgeon, a prominent Baptist preacher known as the Prince of Preachers, expressed concerns about the theological liberalism and the perceived decline and doctrinal fidelity within the Baptist Union. So Charles Haddon Spurgeon had obviously a certain understanding of doctrine, a certain way that he thought things should be. And then the Baptist Union started changing that or going in a different direction. And so Charles Haddon Spurgeon would have referred to that as theological liberalism and that they were declining in their doctrinal fidelity. And so he was going to speak out against it. Now, so many times in church history, that's always like one side will be like, oh, this is a threat to Christianity. Christianity is in decline. It's going to be the end of everything because you disagree with a certain theological stance. Now, what's always funny here is the one side's like, oh, this is going the wrong way. And the other side are like, no, we're going the right way. Because I don't know if you realize this, Christianity is constantly divided. There's division, disagreement on literally everything. So one side will always perceive the other side to be, oh, that's a threat to Christianity. This is the end. We're all falling apart. And the other side will be like, no, we're doing things the right way. You're doing things the wrong way. And then you go back and forth. So sometimes the perception of a threat is based on, well, what you believe is to be true doctrine versus what someone else believes to be true doctrine, right? I mean, if we go back to the famous book, The Gospel According to Jesus by John MacArthur, which, kind of brought lordship salvation concept into the mainstream, he believed Christianity was a mess. Christianity was on a downgrade in a sense. Christianity was falling apart. And so he needed to restore a right understanding, I guess, of justification and sanctification and who was really saved and who wasn't saved. But if you reject lordship salvation, you would see that as a turning point to where the gospel started being rewritten, and it was a gospel. Now it was the law masquerading as gospel. So again, it depends on your perception, right? Your perception will have a lot to determine what the threat is or isn't a threat. But in this particular case, this all started in the 1880s. Now, the roots that's kind of the background. 1880s, Baptist Union, Charles Haddon Spurgeon basically expressed that they had started turning to theological liberalism and a decline of doctrinal fidelity. The roots of the dispute. Spurgeon observed what he believed to be a downgrade in the Baptist Union, where some ministers were moving away from traditional Christian beliefs and embracing liberal theology and questioning the authority of the Bible. So there's kind of the roots of it. The publication of the downgrade in 1887. Spurgeon published a series of articles addressing the theological drift he saw within the Baptist Union. He warned of the dangers of compromise and urged a return to biblical orthodoxy. Now, I remember reading many of those articles. I think you can still find them easily online. And I think I read them, I don't remember, somewhere in the 1990s. I don't remember exactly when. And I was like, ooh. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, this was what was happening then. Let me look at the church in the 1990s, going all the way into the 2000s. And I was like, this is how. And then when I first became a pastor, I was like, oh, this is happening. So in some ways, my early ministry was really kind of modeled after this idea that the downgrade is in full effect. We've got this seeker-sensitive, purpose-driven church nonsense. The church is turning into a circus. It's fun, food, and fellowships. We have theological illiteracy, biblical illiteracy. We've got to fix this. We've got to combat this. The church is a joke. I'm going to have a church that's going to do things completely different. We're going to fight against this. And it was like, yeah, go in and fight. So I was greatly influenced by the downgrade controversy, believing that the downgrade controversy was happening right here in the United States of America, going into the 90s, into the 2000s, and I was going to fight it, and I was going to combat it, and I was going to change it, and I was going to create a church that was going to do things radically different. Now, yes, the church did things radically different. Now, obviously, it didn't matter because, my way. My way wasn't necessarily the best way one could argue from a human perspective. But I was greatly influenced by this entire controversy, all right? The controversy and opposition. Spurgeon's criticism sparked a heated debate within the Baptist Union. Some ministers and leaders criticized him for being divisive and causing discord within the denomination. This leads then to resignation. In 1888, Spurgeon withdrew from the Baptist Union, citing his inability to remain in a fellowship with those who he believed were departing from foundational Christian truths. His departure was a significant event in the controversy. The legacy, the downgrade controversy, has long-lasting implications for the Baptist Union and for evangelical Christianity in general. It highlighted the tensions between theological conservatism and liberalism within the Protestant denominations, and emphasized the importance of maintaining doctrinal integrity. And I think many within the fundamentalist movement was kind of like, they fought those same battles, right? The fundamentalist was like, no, the theological liberalism is coming into the seminaries. It's coming into the Southern Baptists. It's coming into many of these denominations. The evangelicalism is kind of embracing this modernism. So the fundamentalist was like, that's it. We're going to pull out of these denominations. We're going to pull out of these seminaries. We're going to create independent churches, and we're going to have Bible institutes so that we're not sending our men to these liberal institutions, and we're going to have an independent church so that we're not caught up in these liberal denominations. So in a sense, the downgrade controversy, you could argue, set kind of a precedent, laid down a blueprint for how many perceived we're going to fight against many of these things. And, well, they withdrew themselves. They left the denominations. They left it. And so, had a major impact. The impact on Spurgeon, the controversy took a toll on Spurgeon's health, and he faced criticism and isolation from some quarters. However, he remained steadfast in his convictions and continued his ministry outside the confines of the Baptist Union until his death in 1892. Some books try to act like that it had such a profound impact on him that it contributed to his death. I don't know if we have any actual justification for that claim. It definitely makes it more dramatic. Here's Spurgeon, in a sense, kind of like Luther. He's standing against liberalism. He's fighting it, and now he's isolated, and he's hated, and his health falls apart, and he ultimately dies. You could get into a historical. There are those who have studied Spurgeon's life far better than I have, who could probably be more dogmatic about the possible connection or lack thereof. From a dramatic standpoint, it feels like, it makes the story more dramatic. But we don't need drama to add to the story. We just need, whenever you take a stand against where the church is going, you trust me, you will end up isolated and criticized. And you'll be viewed as the bad. I know that absolutely. You cannot be, you being the critic where the church is going, you typically then are going to be thrown out of the current. You're going to be like, the current's going this way and you're stepping out of the current. The current's going to leave you behind. And you've got to be very, 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 very careful if you want your ministry to survive, because in many cases, you've got to kind of find your current, you got to stay in it. Where I never wanted to be in any one current, right? I didn't want to be in a current. I didn't want to be a part of a team. I wanted to be like, in fact, I'm going to reach down here. I'm going to pick up a Bible. I wanted to be on this team. We're going to study this. And we may believe what we study today has no impact on what we're going to study tomorrow. Because if we study this again tomorrow, 15 days later, a year later, we're going to reapproach it. And we're never going to be committed to just like our previous understanding of a text has any bearing on what we're going to understand that text tomorrow, because tomorrow we'll study the text again. We're not committed to a team. We're ready to study the text and call into question anything with or without offense to anyone. We're going to question every team. We may end up ticking off the Reformed team, the non-Reformed team, the Pelagian team, the semi-Pelagian team, the Augustinian team, the amillennial team, the premillennial team, the dispensationalist team, the covenant theology. We may tick off everybody. Well, that sounds good, right? That sounds like, yeah. See, there was a time I'd be like, that's it. I'm going to fight. I don't care. I'm not worried about a team. We're going to study the text and we're going to pursue truth. And there's got to be people out there more hungry and desiring truth instead of worrying about which team they're on. Well, how wrong was I? Because people will abandon you to go join a team so that they feel like there's some kind of, maybe it gives them a greater sense of stability or security. And I'm like, well, pursuing truth is not about stability or security. It's about trying to figure out this text and questioning it. But that was a threat facing the church in the 1800s. And guess what? If you read some of the articles, it sounds dire. Sounds desperate. It sounds like the church is in trouble. It sounds like it's over. And you read some of the things, Spurgeon discussed. It felt like the theological end of the world in some ways. And this happens so many times. Whatever the issue is, whatever the dispute is, hey, this is the threat facing the church. All the publications about that threat will make it sound like this is the end. The church is not going, basically acting like the church is not going to survive it. But then, it continues on and everyone seems to move forward. So that's what was going on in the 1880s. Now let's jump to 2024. And let's look at the article that was published today, May the 21st, 2024. You can find it at the Christian Post. Headline. So we go from the downgrade controversy in the 1800s. Now we jump to 2024. George Barna identifies the biggest threats facing the church. We've reached a time of Christian invisibility. Now, I told you at the beginning to write down what you believe the greatest threats to the church are. Now, if you want really quick, you can't hit pause because I'm live currently, but if you're listening to this on demand, you can hit pause at this point, and I want you to write down what you think, your prediction of what George Barna is going to believe is the greatest threat to the church. You've got what you think. Now, what's your prediction? You can just start writing one or two down right now. All right. So are you ready? Here we go. I need paper. All right, here we go. Even though it's actually a screen, but it doesn't, I can tap the screen. It doesn't make any cool sounds. All right, here we go. Are you ready? George Barna, a leading expert in church and worldview trends, has weighed in on some of the biggest issues facing the church, including the steady decrease in a biblical worldview and dwindling concern for spiritual formation at a time of Christian invisibility in our culture. Now, there's giving you a little bit of hint of things that he believes that we're facing, but I'm not going to jump into my commentary right there. We'll continue on and then circle back. In an interview with the Christian Post, the leader or the founder of Barna Group, they give his age, 69 years of age. I don't know why we care about how old he is, but I guess maybe because by giving his age, then he's a man who's been around for a long time, so he's seen many things. Maybe it gives a greater sense of authority to his perspective. So let me read it the way they've written it. I'm doing my own editing in real time. In an interview with the Christian Post, the 69-year-old founder of the Barna Group, a market research firm specializing in studying Americans' religious beliefs and behaviors, he said that over the last few decades, he has seen certain negative trends increasingly permeate Western Christianity. All right, so he believes this has been going on for the last few decades, that there's these negative trends permeating, getting inside of Western Christianity. All right. I definitely am curious where he's going to go. I believe, to me, for the last few decades, from my perspective and what I've witnessed, people have been yelling and screaming about all the negative things coming into Christianity. So is it going to be those things that I feel like everyone's been yelling about for the last few decades? I don't know. Now, I don't know how he's been watching it all unfold. I have been in the middle of it, watching it unfold, warning about it, broadcasting about it, preaching about it, trying to fight against it. My solutions, obviously, from a human perspective, failed miserably, but that's okay. I have been definitely trying to fight against it. I don't know where he is now after watching it unfold for decades. Where I am now after watching it unfold for decades is I'm just kind of reached a point like, I don't want to say maybe I've thrown up my arms and says, who cares? But I've kind of reached a, just like, whatever. I think I used to put the blame more at the foot of the church. I know I did. Now I kind of put the blame on the in the pew. I think the problem here is not the church. I think it's the people. And I started seeing this, my first thing that should have really woken me up to this. I know I got very frustrated. Paul Washer, he had a sermon. Oh man, it kind of went viral. I don't know if the term viral was used at the time, but it was everywhere. It was like 10 indictments against the modern church or something along those lines. Everyone loved it. Oh, this is the greatest sermon. You got to hear this sermon. You got to hear. I don't know how many people have. You've got to hear this sermon. Oh, this sermon was so good. This sermon was so good. You've got to hear this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is like, everyone's acting like this is the greatest sermon in the world. So I started listening to it and I was taken back at the time, right? I was like, wait, I'm so perplexed and confused because all the people talking about how great this sermon is, those were the very people attending the very kinds of churches that were being condemned in the very message. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You're telling me this is the greatest sermon ever, but look at the church you go to. It's actually condemned by it. Well, and then they would make excuses. I'm like, no. If you really believe this sermon is so wonderful, then you would not be attending that church. You would leave that church. You would do everything in your power to support other churches that are not doing those things. But in many cases, people don't want to leave their nice big church with their programs and their activities, and they got everything they want, and it's nice, and the kids love it because it's got a big youth program and they got lots of activities and events. I'm like, no. You're literally part of the problem. Stop blaming those other church. Stop blaming the church. The church only can function if the people are there. And at that time, I was like, okay, we're going to do church radically different. We're not going to have fun, food, and fellowship and activities. It's going to be teaching, preaching, doctrine, theology. We're going to not just learn theology. We're going to do theology and all. And well, yeah, until people all left to go to churches that just do church the way everyone I thought was condemning. With a fun, food, fellowship, and activity. Oh, but it's much more. Well, okay, whatever. Like, so in some cases, I like those negative trends. You can blame the church. I put the blame more at the people. Now I've kind of really changed my view. Let's see if that proves to be true in this discussion here. Let's read the next paragraph. Quoting from Barna from this interview with the Christian Post. I quote, "People have become more selfish. Churches have become less influential. Pastors have become less Bible-centric," he said. People have become more selfish? I think people have always been selfish. Maybe they disguised it better. Look, I think there may be a time people disguise it better, but the church has always been filled with selfish people. You know why? Because that's the very essence of our sinful nature, which we still possess even after salvation. Even though Christians try to act like that's not the case, we do. So maybe the selfishness is more seen. It's more evident. I think it's always been there. I mean, I've seen it a million different ways in churches my whole Christian life. You can see that. I've seen it in myself. Churches have become less influential. I think churches have become less influential because churches have basically surrendered itself to a political ideology. So now it's politics that's more influential than the church because the church has surrendered to politics. The church has prostituted itself to political parties and political ideology. So it looks like the politics are the one that are influential. I think the church thought, no, we can be influential. No, really, you've just sold yourself. You've prostituted yourself so that politicians are the ones being influential. All right. We could have that discussion. And pastors have become less biblical centric or less Bible centric. Well, I wonder why. Pastors become less Bible centric because the people in the pew don't want Bible centric. Even though they may say they do, they don't. They want a robe of spirituality. They want to feel like it's Bible centric without it not truly being Bible centric. They want it to be Bible centric pretend, not Bible centric in reality. That's my feelings. A lot of people say, oh no, my church is so Bible-centric. And I'll go listen to the sermon. I mean, like, give me a break. It didn't deal with half the problems in that text. It's not even trying. Because I think if you're truly Bible-centric, you're struggling through the text. You're going, well, it could be this, but there's this problem, and there's this problem, and there's this problem. And because you're really trying to be fair to the text. But people don't want that. They want little nice put together sermons with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, 3 nice little points, and get out at noon so you can get to the buffet. Goes on, families have invested less of their time and energy in spiritual growth, particularly of their children. Now, when it says families have invested less of their time and energy in spiritual growth, now, once again, this is where I always get conflicted. So wait a minute. So people go to church, but then they have to invest extra time outside of church for spiritual growth. So then this raises the question, well, if my spiritual growth is happening more outside the church than inside the church, then what's the point of the church? If you go to church, but then you're told, hey, if you're really going to grow as a Christian, if you're really going to, you've got to go home and do this and this and this and this. Well, if I'm at home doing this, then what's the point of driving back to this place? Because I have to do all of this outside of this place. This is one of those things I've been raising the question a lot over the last few years. What is the church really worth when you take all the money, all the time to have that building, have that whole structure, have all those people employed, pay all of those bills, all of the upkeep, buy all the material, all the money that goes in just making a church function, and then you're saying that the problem is people aren't really growing. The families are not really invested. They're investing less time and energy in spiritual growth. Now, are you saying they're spending less time in spiritual growth because they're not going to church? Or are you saying they're spending less time outside of church? What I constantly hear that, church isn't enough. You've got to do this and you've got to do this. You've got to do this. Well, look, I understand that on one level. I do agree with that. But on the other, if you're doing all the work at home, then what's the point of the church? Do you go to church just to see your friends? You go to church for a sense of community and as a social function where you can feel like your social needs are being met? Now, I've talked about this before in broadcast that most people, and when I asked the question, most of the listeners of this broadcast, without fail, all said that most of their spiritual growth and most of their learning occurred outside of the local church. Then you're like, well, then what's the point? Why is the local church even existing? And why are people spending less time in spiritual growth? They go on to say the media now influences the church more than the church influences the media or the culture for that matter. So the media and the culture are influencing the church more than the church is influencing the media and the culture. Now, this raises lots of questions. How much should the church be influencing media and culture? And when people say that, what does that look like? Well, what it typically looks like is this strategy like, so the church has to take over media. The church has to take over culture. If the church wants to influence media and culture, the way the church influences those segments of society is not by trying to take it over, It's by Christians living out their Christian life and more people becoming Christians and living out their Christian life. If everyone's living out their Christian life, then it will have an influence, right? Because more and more people are becoming Christians. But Christians tend to have this strategy. Well, hey, the church is not influencing media because look at the movies that are being made. They're not Christian. Well, you know why? Well, then Christians should take over media and only make Christian movies? Like, I don't understand that strategy. I think that's just ridiculous, right? I think that's ridiculous. Look, you don't have to take over media. All Christians have to do is, well, I mean, I know this gets into this never-ending argument about what a Christian can or can't watch, what they can or can't do. But if Christians can just stop watching things that they don't like, and then I guess if the numbers decrease so dramatically, then the culture will have to then produce content that then makes all the Christians happy. But trust me, you'll never make all the Christians happy no matter what you make. You can make a Christian movie and you'll get 20, 30% of Christians criticizing the Christian movie. I think that's why that's not very sustainable, but okay. Now, is culture influencing the church? I think that's always been the case. I think if any argument to say that it's somehow changed is ridiculous. The book of 1 Corinthians, that is a letter written to a church that was located in a city. The city was influencing the church more than the church was influencing the city. That's always been the way it works because the people in your church live in the culture. They are surrounded by the culture and they're influenced by it. And then they bring that culture into the church. So how do you negate that influence? Okay, well, we could have a discussion about that way. He goes on to say, the Christian body tends to get off track arguing about a lot of things that really don't matter. Well, Christianity has been arguing about things that matter or don't matter for 2,000 years. All right, he continues. On a wider scale, one of the most troubling trends Barna highlights is the decline in discipleship and a lack of solid biblical training from seminaries. Oh, boy. This is where I'm going to lose my ever-living mind. I am so utterly sick of hearing the constant complaining about the decline of discipleship and somehow say that's a problem. That's not a church problem. That's a person problem. Look, I have changed my view on. I used to argue, hey, the reason Christians are so biblically illiterate is they're not being discipled by the church. The church is failing. The church is letting people down. We're going to be a church that's going to disciple. We're going to be a church that teaches. We're going to be forget it. It's a waste of it's a waste of your time. It's a waste of breath even complaining about this. People who aren't discipled are because they don't want to be discipled. It's an absolute joke for anyone to make any excuse. Your lack of theological knowledge, your lack of biblical knowledge is your fault. Don't blame the church. Don't blame your pastor. Blame yourself. It's 2024. You have available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Bible teaching, sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon, the theological discussions, theological lectures, Christian podcasts. You've got every tool available to you to help you understand the Greek, understand the Hebrew. You've got every tool to help you understand the text. You've got every kind of Bible that could ever be dreamed up available to you. You've got commentaries. You've got everything. You've got charts. You've got Bible study guides. You've got study guides. You've got devotionals. You're literally drowning in more biblical information to disciple you than at any time in the history of Christianity. The lack of discipleship is a lack of people who want to be discipled. It's a lack of people who care. That's the issue is, why do people not care? Why do people not want to learn? Why do people not want to participate? I know that you can turn on the microphone hour after hour after hour. You can try to give people assignments. You can try to give people things to participate in. Will you get people to even participate? You have to beg and plead. I watched it even as a pastor, buying study guides and devotional guides and handing them to the people in the church, saying, do this, read, handing them. Can you get them to participate? In most cases, no, they will not. They will show up to church, and that is it. And don't even get me started on this garbage about seminaries. I'm so tired of hearing the complaint about seminaries. Now, this is where I'll blame the church. The entire seminary industrial complex is the result of absolute lazy, worthless churches. Stop sending people off to seminary. Churches should be training men for ministry. In the church, the men go to that church. They have their family in that church. They help support that church with their time, their effort, and their money. And then guess what? That church then says, okay, you feel like a call to ministry? Well, here's the chance. Start teaching here. Start teaching here. Let's see how you teach. Okay, now we'll do this. Even if you don't have an absolute structured Bible institute, the pastor can start meeting with that man, giving him books to read, talking about this, discussing this, giving those men assignments so that they can turn in, giving them tests, working with them, seeing how they're progressing in their theological knowledge and their biblical knowledge, having them turn in sermons that they have written, having them outline, giving them hermeneutical assignments. And then slowly but surely, as that man progresses through the training, however you want to measure their movement, then you're like, okay, we will ordain you. You don't have to send them off to some seminary where they pay all of this money so they can pat them. Ooh, I graduated from Bob Jones, or I graduated from Dallas Theological Seminary, or I graduated from Westminster. Give me a break. And I'm one who obviously loves education. How many different schools have I gone to and graduated from? But you know what? I've seen people who go to these big schools and I've listened to their sermons. They have no greater understanding of the text of people I've seen graduate from a Bible institute. So the church helped create that. This entire seminary industrial complex needs to just be not physically, but metaphorically burnt to the ground so that none of them exist. All those schools are gone. All those buildings have been sold and it's gone. There's no more of that. And then men are being trained in their local congregations. Now I know that makes me the enemy of that entire world, but that's okay. People pay all this money to go off to these schools to get a degree. And what? For what? They're going to be now a better and then you're told after you get these big degrees to go back, and when you preach to the people now, you got to keep it like at a 7th grade level. You can't get too in depth. You can't do that. You can't do that. I don't know how many times I've been told, you can't go into all of that. You can't just stop telling me what I can and can't do. Now maybe they were right because, everyone left, but the point I just think it's ridiculous that idea. Barna went on to criticize the prevalent metrics used by churches to gauge success: attendance, fundraising, and infrastructure. Now, I agree that we can all argue you should not gauge success by attendance, fundraising, and infrastructure. But ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, if you do not have attendance and you do not have fundraising, you don't exist anymore as a church. So you can say, well, I'm going to keep it real and I'm going to preach this way. Well, I kept it real and I preached a certain way and said this is going to be a church that does theology, not just teach theology. And we're going to dig in and we're going to have a Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday. We're going to do this. And well, then guess what? When the people don't want it and they all leave, guess what happens? Well, your building gets put up for sale and that becomes the end of your church. So you can say, you should not measure success that way. Your survival is measured that way. You don't have enough people showing up. What happens? What happens if your Sunday night service drops down to almost no people? You get rid of your Sunday evening service. What happens if you don't have enough money? Well, someone's salary's not going to get paid. Some bill's not going to be paid. You're not going to have electricity. You're not going to have power. Well, guess what? You're going to have to fundraise. Infrastructure. You got to have a building for people to meet. That's why that entire structure, it becomes about survival and making money. And that's why the whole structure in many cases is fraudulent, I think. He goes on to say, he says that those things, attendance, fundraising, and infrastructure, has little to do with Jesus's mission. Well, it may have little to do with Jesus's mission, but the minute you have buildings and you hire staff and you have payments and building and all of the things that come with it, I'm sorry, we wrap it up in a robe of spirituality, but that becomes the mission. You got to sustain it. He goes on, there is poor leadership in seminaries that mislead local churches into thinking they're actually training individuals whom God has called to be leaders and are qualified to be leaders and certifying them to lead local churches, not knowing any better, bringing them on, he said. Well, seminaries may be misleading people. I think seminaries ripping everyone off. That's what I think. If you're a young man and your church won't train you for ministry and you feel like you have to go off to school, no, find a church that will train you. What better way to learn about ministry than in the middle of a ministry? What better way to learn about church than in church? What better way to learn? Right there. That's where it should happen. The church that you're committed to, the church you're supporting financially, the church you're helping out with. Well, then that church then is there. That's the place to learn and to teach and to struggle and to fail and to figure it. That's where it should all take place. Barna clarified that while many seminaries have good intentions, they set young ministry leaders up for failure. Well, I think the whole thing is a failure. He goes on to say, you get what you measure, he contends. So if you measure the wrong things, you'll get the wrong outcomes. Pastors measure how many people show up, how much money they raise, and how many programs they offer, how many staff persons they hire, how much square footage they built out. Jesus didn't die for any of that. So we're measuring the wrong stuff, and consequently we get the wrong outcomes. Well, it's always great for someone like Barna or people outside of the church going, man, they're measuring the wrong things. They need to stop worrying about these things. Tell them to stop worrying about these things. That's their livelihood. You do understand, right? If people don't show up and give money, they don't have a job. Their house payment doesn't get paid for. They don't exist. See, I know we like this See, I had the same romanticized idea in my mind, right? But then you kind of realize, I'm not going to, but then there was a part of me like, I'm not going to make this about money because I was bivocational at the time and didn't need any money, right? So I'm like, I'm not taking a dime from this church. I'm not taking a dime from anyone. No one's going to accuse me of doing this for money. And so I had this like noble intention. Now, ultimately, for year after year, I didn't need any money because it was great. And then finally the church was like, well, look, at some point we have to pay you something. So we'll pay your house payment. Okay, great. They make my house payment. Then of course, everyone knows how my military career comes in, 100% disabled, all the things that happened to me that caused me to be 100% disabled. We won't get into my whole story. Well, the next thing you know, I'm somewhat dependent on my house payment. Now, once I become dependent on my house payment, now what do? Now, guess what? You know what I have to be worried about? I got to be worried about how many people are attending. I got to be worried about how many people are giving. Now, that's where I became, there's no other nice way to put it. That's where I became an idiot because I was like, you know what? While I'm now dependent somewhat on the church for my financial survival, that's when I should have went into full blown going, okay, how do I please the people? How do I give the people what they want? What can I do to be better at pleasing these people that are attending? But I didn't. I just kept going, and we're going to continue to question. We're going to continue to challenge. We're going to create, hypotheses about theology and about hermeneutics. We're going to question. We're going to struggle. We're going to fix. And well, that became detrimental to the survival of my church. That's when I should have went into full blown, like, you know what? The only thing that matters today is, are you here and are you giving and are you finding other people to bring here? And how can we make the building better so that we can attract more people? And what can we do to advertise? I should have went into full blown that mode, but I was more into, let's figure this out. Oh, let's struggle with this. Well, let's think about this and let's consider this and let's consider this. And what about this? And let's consider, because thinking that that's what people really want. So you can criticize that churches turn into that, but the churches have to be that or they don't survive. To address these issues, Barna advocates for a radical return to biblical roots, but that, he said, might require rethinking modern church structure. Oh, wow. So Barna is like, we may need to rethink modern church structure. Now, I've been asking this question. I've been asking this question for a couple of years because I keep saying it all the time. When I get in my car and I drive past some building, I'm like, I wonder how much it takes to keep that building operating. Well, if it takes that much, that means they're going to have a certain number of people who not only attend, but give, because if that goes below that, they're not going to be able to pay for that building and they're going to be in financial difficulties. So maybe that, and sometimes I'll look what you get from those buildings is not a lot. You don't get a lot of content. And then I'm like, and I always talk about what I can do from this studio with this microphone and an internet connection. I could literally be broadcasting all day today if I want. I could be going hour after hour after hour. We could be doing devotional messages, Bible study. We could be doing everything. So I know that I can produce more content sitting in this room, right? In this room with this computer, I could produce more content than almost any church I've ever seen. They produce so little content. Well, then, what do we do? Well, Barna is saying we may need to rethink church structure. He goes on to say, if we were to go back to the Bible, I think we'd recognize the local church, the institutional church. Okay, let me read this again. If we were to go back to the Bible, I think we'd recognize the local church, the institutional church, as we've created it, is man-made. It's not in the scriptures. Okay, that's kind of a weird way he's writing that. To me, it sounds like what he's trying to say. If we were to go back to the Bible, we would not recognize the local church or the institutional church as we've created it. We would not recognize it. I know he says we'd recognize it, but I think what he's saying is we would not recognize it because look at the very next part. It's not in the scriptures. Right? So much of what we have today is not in the scriptures. I agree. It's not. It's not in the scripture. I think if we went back, there's a lot of what we would not even recognize. Now, that's always the dilemma. Everybody says we want to go back to the early church. But remember, the early church met every single day. They sold all of their possessions. There's a lot of that nobody is going to go back to. But what could we go back to? What should it look like? He goes on to say, the programs, the titles, the buildings, all the stuff that has become a part of American culture and around the world is not necessarily biblical. So the buildings, all of that stuff that we have, the buildings, the titles, the programs, the activities, how much of that has nothing to do with the Bible? Now, the minute you start calling that stuff out, oh man, you're going to be viewed as crazy. Or saying, a lot of people who had ever had anything to do with my church would always like, no programs. There's no activities. There's nothing. There's none. Fellowship is when we come here and open our Bible. There's no picnics. There's no this. If you people want to get together and have picnics, go do it. If you want to get together and have a meal, do it. You don't need the church to structure it, to plan it. That's not what the church is called to do. We show up here for the Lord's Supper or baptism or preaching or prayer or teaching. None of this other stuff has anything to do with the Bible. But you're free as soon as church is over to get together. You can go plan a picnic. You can go have a camping trip, a fishing trip. You can go shopping. You can go underwater basket weaving. You can do it all. You don't need the church. And people, no. We've got to meet together. We got to meet together and talk about the weather or something is wrong with us. Or you just need friends. Well, go make friends and go hang out with them. Barna is like so much of what we do has nothing to do with Scripture. I agree. Now, people have been saying that for forever, and it doesn't seem to change the fact that this stuff now is there. He goes on to say, we make a huge mistake by simply using children as bait rather than as the primary focus of who we want to build up through whatever ministry, impact, or influence we can have. We need to back and recognize it starts with families. Parents have the primary responsibility to raise the children to become spiritual champions. Local churches need to support parents in that endeavor. Our primary focus needs to be on children and growing their biblical worldview. If we do that, we'll be able to grow the 3% of adults who are disciples in America today to a larger proportion. So only 3% of adults who are disciples? Now, he's saying what we need to do is focus on the children. Focus on the children. Focus on the children. Focus on the children. Now, it's always kind of there's a lot of theological implications there, right? Because if you believe in the sovereignty of God and salvation, you believe that salvation is a monergistic work of God. He's the one who saves based off his sovereign choice and that he elects. Well, then you can parent. You can't make a lost person a saved person by all your parenting and by all the church, programs for kids. You can't turn that kid into a Christian by doing that. Now, if you believe in free will, I guess you can try to manipulate that free will. You can try to twist that free will. You can try to get them to make a profession. You can do a lot of things. You can do a lot of manipulating kids, but that ultimately is not going to change anything. If their will is truly free, they may submit to what the pressure that is being placed upon them because you're manipulating their will. But at some point, their will is going to be like, you know what? I was playing games. I don't want any of this. So whether the kid is free, have complete free will, or whether the kid is going to be chosen by God, all your efforts have minimal things that they can accomplish. There are certain things you can do, right? There's certain things you can do, but they're going to be minimal. But my issue is if only 3% of adults are disciples, why? And I don't blame the church for that. That's because the people in the pew just don't care. Barna, who today serves as a professor at Arizona Christian University and the director of research, he told the Christian Post his journey into religious research began. Okay, well, he just goes on to talk about his thing. He goes on to say here, he just kind of goes a little bit into talking about that. He says one trend Barna said he's also concerned about is the potential negative impact artificial intelligence will have on the church. We're already seeing an impact on sermons across the country, he said. Pastors, because they want to do well in some cases, because they're lazy, are realizing AI is a means of getting perhaps a better sermon. All right. Now, let's just stop right here, okay? Oh, man, we're going to run out of time here, but let me at least try to throw this out there. I understand a lot of this complaining about, pastors getting their sermons from AI. This is the downfall of the church. Okay, I hate to break this to you people. Pastors have been getting their sermons from other sources for as long as I can remember. Okay, they find the commentaries and the books that agree with the theological framework of their church. And then they just take those books and turn them into sermons, whether it's Dr. J. Vernon McGee's. Right here. His commentary on, this is his commentary on John chapters 11 through 21. You can just go here. Okay. All right. This is chapter 11, his commentary. Okay. And I could go through this commentary and see how he's going to break this chapter down. Right. And then guess what? Let's see, chapter 11. You see here, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead in Bethany, sixth work. Well, I can start breaking. The pastors will sit down with this book, break it down, and basically preach what J. Vernon McGee preached. Oh, they may add their own little touch to it, depending on the pastor, but they've been getting their sermons from other sources forever. And so many times you can listen to a sermon and you can be like, oh, well, you obviously read Spurgeon on that, or obviously you got MacArthur's commentaries on that, or obviously you heard this, or obviously you read this. And that's where they're getting the stuff from so many times. Sometimes they may structure it themselves, but they're still relying on other content. So when people are like, oh, these pastors are getting sermons from AI, what are we going to do? Well, why weren't you worried about all the other sources they were getting sermons from? He goes, there are other ways that we're going to see it impact us in terms of fundraising, in terms of media presence, he continued. As the body of Christ, we've got to be very suspicious of and careful about anything that even labels itself artificial. It's probably not good for our mental health, our physical health, or our spiritual health. I just encourage genuine leaders to be very cautious about inviting any of that into our lives, and particularly in how we're going to take that then and influence other people's lives. Well, see, this is so weird. Barna's like, hey, we got to be careful about this other stuff. We don't want it to influence our lives. But you're the one who puts out the research for pastors and churches to use your research. So why can they use your research, but they cannot, you don't want them using any AI content? It's content from different sources. Sometimes I think people get caught up like, well, back in my day, we didn't have AI. I know you had commentaries. Back in your day, people were subscribing and getting your research to try to determine what their church should or shouldn't do. Why is your information good, but you can't get information from a different source? And then, he goes on. He goes, the consequences of all that is that the elites in our church will have the opportunity to shut down spiritual freedom, he stressed. We will no longer be allowed to go to church. I see. All right. So he talks here about losing the war. I guess he's concerned that we will no longer be allowed to go to churches. We'll no longer be allowed to buy and read Bibles. We'll no longer be allowed to speak in public about our faith, because it all traces back to the discipleship, not making disciples. So either we put up or shut up. And I would suggest that we put up. So he's basically like, if we don't make disciples, well, then the culture is going to turn against Christianity and we're going to be silenced. Well, I've been hearing that my whole life too, as we're going to be silenced as we're speaking. All right. So, all right, we can get into it. But the thing is when you say we should be making disciples, let me make it very clear. Christians should be discipling themselves, because there's no excuse not to be. You say, well, no, you need the church to disciple them. Well, okay. So if the church is the one to disciple them, then when should that discipleship take place? Now, this is what we found out. This is how this all went down. According to most, well, this real discipleship can't happen in Sunday school. Real discipleship really can't happen from the pulpit. So we need small groups. So we have small groups that are going to disciple people. Well, we've had 1 million small groups running all over this country for it seems like forever. And you're telling me that that's not working either? So all the discipleship material that's been published, all the discipleship programs, all the discipleship conferences, all the discipleship camps, all the discipleship retreats, all of the discipleship small groups, all of these programs, activities, and materials still hasn't worked. But you're still going to say, we have to do this. So why hasn't anything that we've tried worked? It doesn't work if the people in the pew don't want to do anything. The issue is, why are the people in the pew not caring to do anything? Well, you can read the comments under there. We won't get into that. I don't know what else to say about any of this other than this. My feelings at this point in time in my Christian life, I've kind of reached that we can run around and say this is a threat and the church has to do this and the church has to do this and the church. I think the issue needs to stop being so focused on the institution. I do agree that we could get into a whole problem with how the church is structured and should it even look that way. I feel that the issue has to become more instead of institutionalized, it needs to become more individualistic. I'm not saying I've got this mapped out perfectly, but I think it comes down to each Christian trying to figure out how to live out their Christian life to the best of their ability. We have enough of our own problems, our own sin, our own struggles, our own failures, our own shortcomings. If each individual Christian becomes more focused on spiritual, more godly, and then they help other people do so. I think the issue is more of an individual issue than an institutional issue. Maybe I'm wrong there. But I'm tired of hearing that, we need a new program to discipleship people. I'm so tired of hearing that. Christians have more available to them than at any point in the entire history of the human race. If a Christian wants to be discipled, they can spend all day being discipled. They can spend all night. They've got content. There's just so much. I don't know what else to say. What do you think? What do you think the greatest threat is to the church? What do you think about his threat? His AI argument there is just ridiculous to me. Hey, we got to be careful. AI is going to be dangerous and going to destroy us. Just stop that. It's going to be utilized as a tool. Now, could AI lead to something catastrophic maybe in the broader culture? We could discuss that. I'm talking within the church, pastors using AI. I think we got to stop the whole, what are we going to do? Pastors have been using resources forever. It's what they do with it. And the same thing is true with the other resources. Some pastors just basically copied their sermons from other resources almost verbatim. Now, at that time, it was harder to check. Now it's much easier to check. But pastors are still taking and borrowing from it. If the AI helps pastors build better sermons, well, then everyone should be beneficial. Now, we could argue how much actually gets accomplished through the preaching of sermons, because we've had the culture filled with sermons, and every time I turn around, nobody's being discipled. We have all of these problems. So then all the preaching, all the small groups, all the Sunday school classrooms, none of it accomplished anything. Yeah, I know that's a very jaded way of looking at it, but you can give me your thoughts and feedback on all of this by emailing me at newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. And yes, you can hear that I'm just much more kind of jaded about all of this. Because in some ways, that's Barna putting out a new article. That I feel like I could have read that article. I feel like Christians have been saying those same things at least since the 1800s, all through the 1900s, 2000s, 2010s, now in the 2020s. I feel like I've read that same article 5,000 times. That, to me, should be the more serious question. All right, email me, newsif@yahoo.com. That's newsif@yahoo.com. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thanks for listening. God bless.